My husband emptied our $3 million joint account the day after our 15th anniversary. "I'm leaving you for Vanessa," he said, tossing divorce papers on the table. That's when I opened the safe and handed him documents for my secret $47 million offshore investment portfolio. "Actually," I smiled, "I'll be buying your family's company at tomorrow's emergency board meeting." His face went pale when he realized who'd been financing his debt-ridden family business for the past 3 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The crystal flutes clinked delicately as 70 of Boston's financial elite toasted my husband's newest achievement. The grand ballroom of the Harrington Hotel glittered with old money and fresh ambition, a perfect setting for celebrating James Westbrook's promotion to managing director at Maxwell Financial. "To James," announced Philip Maxwell, the silver-haired patriarch whose name adorned the building where my husband had spent the last decade climbing hierarchical rungs, the youngest managing director in our firm's 80-year history. I stood at James's side, draped in a designer gown I'd selected specifically for this occasion. Elegant, but unobtrusive. The perfect complement to my husband's bespoke suit and calculated charisma. My practiced smile revealed nothing of the complex calculations running through my mind as I surveyed the room, mentally categorizing each guest by their net worth, influence, and potential usefulness. "And of course," Philip added as an afterthought, "to Rebecca, the woman behind the man." The woman behind the man. 5 words that simultaneously acknowledged and diminished my existence. The room raised their glasses to me with the polite deference reserved for executive spouses, a brief recognition before attention returned to the man of the hour. What none of them knew, not even James, was that while I played the role of supportive wife, I had quietly built an investment portfolio that would make several men in this room pale with envy. The woman behind the man was, in fact, financially outperforming him by a considerable margin. I hadn't planned to keep my success secret when we first married. James and I had met during our MBA program at Harvard 15 years ago. Both ambitious, both brilliant, both determined to leave our mark on the financial world. We were equals then, competitive but respectful of each other's talents and dreams. Our professors had even nicknamed us the dynamic duo, acknowledging our complementary strengths. The change had been gradual, beginning with our first jobs after graduation. James joined Maxwell Financial, a prestigious old guard institution where his family had connections. I took a risk on Horizon Investments, a newer firm with innovative approaches to global markets. Within 3 years, I had outpaced James both in portfolio performance and compensation. That's when I noticed the subtle shift in our relationship. Comments about my lucky streaks. Tensions when I discussed my successes. The way his mood would darken after investor events where someone praised my work. Small things, but they accumulated like interest. You know how fragile male egos can be. My mentor Elaine had observed over lunch one day, 7 years into my marriage, especially ones cultivated in traditional firms like Maxwell. "James isn't like that," I'd defended, though a part of me recognized the truth in her words. He's always supported my career. Elaine, 20 years my senior and one of Boston's most successful investment strategists, had given me a knowing look. "Just be careful how brightly you shine, Rebecca. Men like James want successful wives, but not wives who eclipse them." I'd dismissed her concern initially, but over the next year, found myself unconsciously dimming my professional visibility when James was present. Declining speaking opportunities at conferences we both attended, downplaying successful deals, when discussing our workdays, small compromises that I justified as marital harmony. Then came the Westbrook family crisis. James's father, Franklin Westbrook, had made a series of catastrophic investments that threatened to bankrupt their multi-generational wealth. The night James discovered the extent of the damage, he sat ashen-faced at our kitchen table, financial statements scattered before him. "Everything's gone," he whispered. "The family estate, the summer house, all of it, leveraged to cover his losses. There's nothing left." The raw vulnerability in his eyes had stirred something protective in me. James had always defined himself by the Westbrook legacy, 5 generations of financial acumen and social standing in Boston's elite circles. That identity was crumbling before him. "What about Maxwell?" I'd asked. "Couldn't Philip help restructure the debt?" James had laughed bitterly. "If Philip knew my family was on the verge of bankruptcy, my career would be over. Maxwell Financial doesn't elevate people with questionable financial backgrounds to leadership positions." That night, after James had finally fallen into restless sleep, I made a decision that would alter the course of our lives, though I didn't recognize it then. I would use my personal investment funds to secretly stabilize the Westbrook finances. Not by giving the money directly to James or his father, but by becoming an anonymous creditor through a series of shell companies. I worked with my private attorney to structure the arrangement, creating an offshore entity that purchased the Westbrook debt at a discount, then offered generous restructuring terms. To James and his father, it appeared that a mysterious foreign investor had seen potential where others hadn't. "It's extraordinary luck," Franklin had declared at dinner the following month, his composure restored along with his credit rating. "This investor, Chen Holdings, seems to understand the long-term value of our assets." James had been suspicious initially. Foreign investors don't offer terms this favorable without expecting something substantial in return. "Perhaps they have their reasons," I'd suggested carefully. "Maybe diversifying into American family holdings offers tax advantages we don't understand." The crisis averted. Our marriage settled back into its comfortable rhythm. James continued his ascent at Maxwell, while I quietly expanded my private investment activities. With Elaine's guidance, I established a separate entity, Artemis Capital, registered in Singapore, through which I managed increasingly complex international investments. My offshore portfolio grew steadily, far outpacing the joint investment account I maintained with James. Every quarter, I transferred just enough of my earnings to our shared finances to maintain the impression of a successful, but not exceptional, career. The rest disappeared into Artemis Capital, invisible to my husband and his social circle. For 8 years, this arrangement functioned perfectly. James received the recognition and status he craved through Maxwell Financial. I exercised my full financial talents through Artemis, finding satisfaction in complex deals that remained my private triumph. Our marriage, like any long-term investment, had found its equilibrium through appropriate diversification of resources. Or so I thought until the Maxwell Financial Gala celebrating the firm's 80th anniversary. James had been unusually attentive in the weeks leading up to the event, insisting I purchase a specific designer gown, scheduling appointments with his preferred stylist for my hair and makeup. I'd attributed his behavior to the significance of the occasion. Philip Maxwell had hinted at major organizational announcements. "You look absolutely perfect," James had approved as I emerged from our bedroom in the midnight blue silk gown with its subtle sapphire accents, colors that complemented his trademark Maxwell Financial tie. The ballroom hummed with anticipation as Philip Maxwell took the podium for his address. James's hand found mine, squeezing with unusual intensity as Philip began announcing the firm's restructuring plan. Maxwell Financial has thrived for 80 years by adapting to changing markets while maintaining our core values of trust, excellence, and family, Philip proclaimed. Tonight, I'm pleased to announce the next phase in our evolution, the establishment of Maxwell Global, a new division focused on international markets. I felt James's posture straighten beside me, his breath quickening slightly. This expansion requires leadership with both innovative vision and deeply rooted understanding of our firm's values, Philip continued. Therefore, I'm delighted to announce that James Westbrook will be appointed Chief Executive Officer of Maxwell Global, effective immediately. The room erupted in applause. James rose to accept the position with practiced humility, delivering an acceptance speech that struck the perfect balance between gratitude for tradition and excitement for the future. I smiled proudly from my seat, genuinely happy for his achievement, while my mind raced with the implications. Maxwell Global would be directly competing in markets where Artemis Capital had established significant positions. My invisible success now risked colliding with James's very public role. Later that evening, as guests circulated with champagne and congratulations, I overheard a conversation that stopped me cold. "James is perfect for global expansion," Philip was saying to another board member. "His wife's family connections in Asian markets will give us the foothold we need in Singapore." I froze, champagne flute halfway to my lips. My family had no connections in Singapore. My parents were academics from Connecticut with no international business ties whatsoever. The only Singapore connection was my carefully concealed Artemis Capital. I circulated through the crowd until I reached James, who was deep in conversation with several senior partners. "Could I steal my husband for just a moment?" I asked, with the deferential tone expected of corporate wives. Once separated from the group, I kept my smile firmly in place. "What exactly have you told Philip about my family connections in Singapore?" A flicker of something, discomfort perhaps, crossed James's face before his expression resettled into confident charm. "Just that you have extensive networks there. Philip doesn't need to know the details." "James, I don't have family connections in Singapore. My parents have never even visited Asia." He took a sip of his scotch, eyes scanning the room rather than meeting mine. "It's just business positioning, Rebecca. Everyone embellishes their advantages. By the time we actually need those connections, we'll have developed them." "By leveraging—" "What, exactly?" I pressed, maintaining my pleasant expression for any observing eyes. "Your Horizon work, your MBA network," he replied dismissively. "We'll figure it out. This is a tremendous opportunity for us." For us. The words hung between us, heavy with assumption. James had volunteered my non-existent connections to advance his career, never once consulting me about this us opportunity. "We'll discuss this at home," I said finally, unwilling to create a scene that would undermine his moment. That night, as James slept soundly beside me, his conscience unburdened by his fabrications, I lay awake, reassessing the careful balance I'd maintained for years. By accepting the Maxwell Global position, James had unwittingly placed himself in direct competition with my Artemis investments. By inventing my family connections, he had created expectations I couldn't possibly fulfill without revealing my secret financial activities. The equilibrium of our marriage had been disrupted not by market forces but by James's ambition. A correction was inevitable. I just hadn't anticipated how dramatic that correction would be, nor how soon it would arrive. The following Wednesday, I returned early from a lunch meeting to find James's assistant Vanessa leaving our apartment, adjusting her clothing with the slightly rushed movements of someone attempting discretion. She froze upon seeing me, her professional composure momentarily abandoned. "Mrs. Westbrook, I was just dropping off some confidential documents for James to review before tomorrow's board meeting." I noted her smudged lipstick, the slight disarray of her usually impeccable hair. "How dedicated," I replied evenly. "Especially since James is currently at the Princeton Club for lunch with Philip. I just spoke with him not 20 minutes ago." Color flooded her cheeks. I must have misunderstood his schedule. "I'll just take the private elevator," I suggested, stepping aside. "It's more discreet than the main lobby." After she departed, I surveyed our apartment with new awareness. Small inconsistencies I'd dismissed over recent months suddenly formed a coherent pattern. Late nights attributed to work emergencies, weekend calls that necessitated his presence at the office, the new cologne he'd started wearing 6 months ago. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Rather than conducting an emotional search for evidence, I approached the situation as I would any investment due diligence. I reviewed our household accounts, identifying unusual expenses, hotel charges in neighborhoods too close to home to be business-related, jewelry purchases from boutiques that had never adorned my jewelry, restaurant bills for establishments I'd never visited. The pattern was both clear and ongoing. James had been having an affair with his assistant for at least 8 months, possibly longer. The discovery should have devastated me, but instead, I felt a curious detachment as I documented each piece of evidence. My marriage, I realized, had become like an underperforming asset I'd kept in my portfolio out of sentimentality rather than sound investment strategy. That evening, when James returned home, I said nothing about Vanessa's visit or my subsequent investigation. Instead, I listened as he enthused about the Maxwell Global strategy, including his plans to open their Singapore office within 6 months. "Philip thinks we should leverage your connections right away," he mentioned casually over dinner. He suggested hosting a reception for potential Asian investors next month. "You'll need to put together a guest list." I took a measured sip of wine. That might be difficult considering I have no actual connections there. James waved away my concern. "You worry too much about details. We'll hire a consultant to identify the right people. You just need to play hostess and mention your family's long-standing interests in the region." "You want me to lie to your clients and colleagues?" "I want you to support my career," he countered, an edge entering his voice. "This promotion is everything I've worked for, everything we've worked for." I studied my husband's face, the confident set of his jaw, the entitled expectation in his eyes. In that moment, I saw with perfect clarity how completely he had misunderstood our marriage. He genuinely believed my purpose was advancing his ambitions, regardless of the cost to my integrity or independence. "I see," I said finally, my decision crystallizing. "And what about Vanessa? Will she be supporting your career at this reception as well?" His fork paused halfway to his mouth. "What about Vanessa?" "She visited our apartment today," I replied calmly, though I doubt she was delivering documents, unless those documents were stored in her undergarments. James's expression shifted, through a series of emotions: surprise, guilt, calculation, and finally, a practiced contrition I recognized from past transgressions. "Rebecca, I can explain. It was a momentary lapse in judgment." 8 months of momentary lapses, I corrected him, "including 3 weekends when you claimed to be at industry conferences but were actually at the Harbor View Hotel on the company credit card." His contrition gave way to defensive anger. "You investigated me? Checked my credit card statements? That's an invasion of privacy." "Joint accounts don't offer privacy, James. They're designed for transparency between partners who trust each other." Something hardened in his expression then, a dropping of pretenses that was almost refreshing after years of subtle manipulation. "What exactly do you want, Rebecca? A tearful apology? A promise it won't happen again? Or is this your opportunity to extract something in exchange for discretion?" The coldness of his calculation confirmed what I had suspected for years. Our marriage had never been a partnership of equals, but a strategic alliance he maintained for appearances and advantage. "Actually," I said, rising from the table, "I want a divorce." The word hung between us, altering the atmosphere as dramatically as a market crash. James recovered quickly, his financial mind immediately assessing implications. "Don't be dramatic," he said, his tone softening into condescension. "We have a 15-year marriage and intertwined finances. A divorce would be messy and expensive. Think about what it would do to both our reputations, to my position at Maxwell." "I have thought about it," I assured him, "quite thoroughly." "Then you realize it's in both our interests to work through this I'll end things with Vanessa. We can see a counselor if you insist. I almost admired his pivot, the swift adjustment from defensive anger to pragmatic reconciliation. It was the same adaptability that had served him well on trading floors. Our interests aren't aligned anymore, James. They probably haven't been for years. A calculating smile spread across his face. Is this about money? Because if you think you'll walk away with half of everything, you should consult our prenuptial agreement. Your contribution to our net worth has been significantly less than mine. I maintained my composure, though inwardly I acknowledged the irony of his assumption. This isn't about money. It's about 15 years of gradually disappearing into your shadow, about compromising my potential to protect your ego, about discovering that while I've been faithfully supporting your ambitions, you've been betraying our vows with your assistant. James leaned back in his chair, studying me with newfound wariness. You've changed, Rebecca. When did you become so hard? I haven't changed, I corrected him. I've simply stopped concealing who I've always been. The woman you married wasn't the supportive shadow you've tried to reduce me to. She was your equal, possibly your superior, who loved you enough to dim her light when yours threatened to flicker. He scoffed. My superior? Your investment returns at Horizon have been consistently average. You haven't managed to move beyond senior portfolio manager in 15 years. His complete unawareness of my actual financial achievements almost made me laugh. For years, I'd maintained the fiction of moderate success to preserve his ego, and he had fully absorbed that narrative as reality. Believe whatever you need to, I said, rising from the table. But our marriage is over. I'll have divorce papers prepared this week. The weeks that followed were a study in strategic positioning. James alternated between conciliatory gestures, flowers, apologies, promises of counseling, and thinly veiled threats about my financial future. I remained politely detached, proceeding methodically with separation arrangements while continuing to maintain the facade of normalcy to his colleagues and family. What James didn't know, couldn't know, was that I had already consulted with Boston's top divorce attorneys, securing the services of Margaret Chen, whose reputation for representing high-net-worth women was unparalleled. Together, we developed a comprehensive strategy that anticipated James's likely moves and countermoves. 2 days before our 15th anniversary, James made his final attempt at reconciliation, suggesting we spend the weekend at a luxury resort in the Berkshires. To reconnect and remember what we built together, he'd said with practiced sincerity. I agreed, recognizing it as an opportunity to finalize certain arrangements without his presence in our apartment. While James was presumably booking our reconciliation getaway, I was meeting with financial advisors, transferring assets, and preparing for the end game I knew was coming. My years of separate financial activities had taught me to anticipate several moves ahead, a skill James had seriously underestimated. Our anniversary arrived with appropriate performative gestures, an expensive gift from James, charged to our joint account, reservations at an exclusive restaurant, public displays of affection that never quite reached his eyes. I played my role perfectly, accepting his gifts with appropriate gratitude while mentally cataloging each expense as evidence for upcoming proceedings. The following morning, as we shared breakfast in seemingly companionable silence, James received a call that took him into his home office. When he emerged 30 minutes later, something had shifted in his demeanor. A new confidence bordering on smugness. That was Philip, he announced casually. The board has approved an extraordinary compensation package for the Maxwell Global launch. We're celebrating at the office today with a private luncheon. How wonderful, I replied, noting his use of we despite the clear exclusion implied by at the office. You've certainly earned it. James studied me for a moment, then made a show of checking his watch. I should get going. Don't wait up tonight. These celebrations tend to run late. After he left, I contacted Margaret Chen to confirm our Final preparations. James's sudden financial windfall would need to be documented for our upcoming negotiations. What I couldn't have anticipated was that James had no intention of negotiating at all. I returned from an afternoon meeting with my financial advisor to discover all my cards declined when I attempted to pay for parking. A quick check of my banking app revealed the shocking truth. Our joint accounts, holding approximately $2.3 million, had been completely emptied. My separate checking account, which I maintained for personal expenses, showed a balance of just $427. My phone rang as I stood staring at the screen. It was James. "By now you've probably noticed some financial adjustments," he said without preamble, all pretense of reconciliation abandoned. "Consider it a preemptive distribution of assets." "You emptied our joint accounts," I stated, my voice calm despite the betrayal. "That's illegal, James." "Actually, it's entirely legal for either party to withdraw funds from joint accounts," he replied, his tone smug with the confidence of someone who believed they held all the power. "I've simply secured what's rightfully mine before you could attempt to claim it. Where's the money? Somewhere safe. My attorney advised taking protective measures given your increasingly erratic behavior." "My increasingly erratic behavior," I repeated, almost amused by the calculated gaslighting. "Your obsessive suspicions, your invasions of my privacy, your sudden desire to end a 15-year marriage, none of that strikes you as unstable." His voice dripped with manufactured concern. "I'm worried about you, Rebecca. Perhaps you should consult a therapist." I recognized the strategy immediately. Establish a narrative of my mental instability to strengthen his position in divorce proceedings. It was precisely what Margaret had warned might happen. "Is there anything else you'd like to tell me, James?" I asked, giving him the opportunity to reveal the full extent of his plans. He hesitated just long enough to confirm my suspicions. "I'll be home in a few hours. We can talk then." When James arrived at our apartment that evening, he wasn't alone. A professionally dressed woman accompanied him. Not Vanessa, but someone with the unmistakable demeanor of legal counsel. "Rebecca, this is Stephanie Carlisle from Maxwell's legal team." James introduced her with transparent false courtesy. "She's helping me sort through some personal matters." "Is bringing corporate counsel to personal matters standard procedure at Maxwell?" I inquired pleasantly, noting the boundary violation of involving his employer's legal resources in our marital dissolution. "Stephanie is a friend who happens to have expertise in family law," James clarified, though the slight flush at his temples betrayed the lie. "Given your emotional state, I thought having a neutral third party present would be beneficial." Smiled at the supposed neutral third party. "How thoughtful. Would you like some tea, Ms. Carlisle, while my husband explains why he's emptied our joint accounts without notice or agreement?" The attorney shifted uncomfortably. "Perhaps I should wait in the car while you two discuss preliminary matters." "That won't be necessary," James interjected firmly. "Rebecca, I've prepared some paperwork that I believe offers a fair resolution to our situation." He removed a document folder from his briefcase and placed it on the coffee table between us. "These are divorce terms that acknowledge our history while protecting both our interests moving forward." I made no move to touch the folder. "And the emptied accounts?" "As I explained, those funds have been secured pending a formal agreement. Once you've signed these papers, I'll establish a reasonable settlement account for you." "Reasonable according to whom?" "The prenuptial agreement you signed clearly states that assets acquired during the marriage through my employment remain mine in the event of dissolution," James explained with exaggerated patience. "However, I'm prepared to be generous. $3 million plus continued residence in the Cambridge property." The amount, while substantial to most people, represented a fraction of our actual marital assets, even excluding my separate holdings. More importantly, it came with strings clearly designed to silence and control me. "In exchange for your generosity?" I prompted, already knowing the answer. "Standard confidentiality provisions," he replied smoothly. Non-disparagement clauses. Agreement not to interfere with my professional relationships. I finally reached for the folder, skimming the documents with practiced efficiency. The terms were exactly as cynical as I'd expected. Financial inducements in exchange for my silence about his affair. Restrictions on my future employment that would prevent me from competing with Maxwell in any capacity. Accelerated timeline. Designed to finalize everything before his Singapore launch. You seem to have thought of everything, I observed, closing the folder. James relaxed visibly, interpreting my calm as capitulation. I'm trying to make this as painless as possible. For both of us, Rebecca. Sign today, and the first $1 million will be in your account by morning. I rose from my seat and walked to the antique secretary desk in our living room, a wedding gift from my parents. From its hidden compartment, I removed a slim leather portfolio. Before I consider your offer, I have something to show you, I said, returning to my seat. A different perspective on our financial situation. James's expression shifted to impatience. Rebecca, there's nothing you could show me about our finances that I don't already know. I think you might be surprised, I replied, opening the portfolio to reveal documents bearing the emblem of Artemis Capital. Are you familiar with this entity? A flash of confusion crossed his face. Should I be? Artemis Capital is a Singapore-based investment firm with approximately $47 million in assets under management, I explained, watching comprehension slowly dawn in his eyes. I established it 8 years ago to manage my personal investments, separately from our joint holdings. James stared at the portfolio statements, disbelief giving way to calculation as he processed the implications. This is some kind of trick. You've never had access to this kind of capital. Actually, I have, I corrected him. My work at Horizon was merely a cover for my private investment activities. Artemis has averaged 31% annual returns since inception. The attorney shifted nervously. Mr. Westbrook, perhaps we should continue this conversation privately. James ignored her, his focus entirely on the documents before him. Even if this is legitimate, it changes nothing about our marital assets. Your prenup clearly states that separate property remains separate. It does indeed, I agreed. Which is why I'm not concerned about the $3 million you've appropriated from our joint accounts. Consider it your consolation prize. His expression hardened. If you think these offshore accounts will remain hidden during discovery, you're mistaken. My attorneys will find every asset. I'm counting on full transparency, I assured him, turning to a different section of the portfolio, especially regarding certain investments Artemis has made over the past 3 years. I handed him a specific document, a shareholder agreement, for a holding company named Chen Investments. James scanned it quickly, his financial training allowing him to grasp its significance immediately. This entity owns the majority of my family's debt, he said slowly, pieces falling into place. The mysterious Asian investor who saved my father from bankruptcy was you? Me, I confirmed, operating through a structure designed to conceal my identity. Your family estate, the summer house in Martha's Vineyard, your father's remaining investments, all secured by loans from Chen Investments. The blood drained from James's face as he fully comprehended his position. Why? Why would you do this secretly rather than just helping us directly? The question revealed how completely he had misunderstood our marriage dynamic. Because even in financial crisis, your pride wouldn't have allowed you to accept help from your wife. You needed to believe you were saved by an anonymous investor who recognized your family's inherent value. So this is blackmail, he concluded, rallying his composure. Sign your terms or you'll call in my family's loans. I shook my head. Not blackmail, James. Leverage. Something you understand quite well, given the divorce terms you just presented me. Rising from my seat, I opened a hidden wall safe concealed behind a painting. Another secret James had never discovered during our marriage. From it, I retrieved a sealed envelope. "These are my terms," I said, placing it beside his folder on the coffee table. "Unlike yours, they don't demand silence or surrender. They simply require honesty." James eyed the envelope with suspicion. What kind of honesty? "The public acknowledgement that our marriage is ending because of your infidelity. Full financial disclosure of all Maxwell assets related to the Singapore expansion. And your resignation from the Maxwell Global CEO position." "That's preposterous," he sputtered. "I won't destroy my career over a private matter." "Your career with Maxwell is already compromised," I informed him calmly. "The moment you presented me as having family connections in Singapore, connections that don't exist, you committed fraud against your employers. When that deception is revealed, along with your misuse of corporate resources for personal matters," I nodded toward the uncomfortable attorney, "Philip will have no choice but to distance the firm from you." James glanced at Stephanie Carlyle, who was now studying her hands with intense focus. "You wouldn't dare. It would create a scandal that would damage both our reputations." "I've spent 15 years being the invisible wife, James. The woman behind the man. Perhaps I'm ready to step into the light, regardless of the temporary discomfort." For the first time in our marriage, I watched genuine fear replace the confidence in James's eyes. Not fear of losing me, but fear of losing everything he valued: his position, his reputation, his carefully constructed image of success. "What exactly do you want?" he asked finally, the question far more genuine than when he'd posed it during our earlier confrontation. "I want what I've earned through my own efforts," I replied simply. "The freedom to operate visibly in financial markets without subordinating my talents to your ego. The truth about our marriage acknowledged rather than concealed. And yes, appropriate compensation for years of supporting your career while suppressing my own." I opened my envelope, extracting a single-page document. "Sign this acknowledgement that you've emptied our joint accounts without consent, and I'll have my attorney contact yours tomorrow with formal dissolution terms." James stared at the document, then at me, reassessing the woman he thought he had known completely. "You've been planning this all along, haven't you? Waiting for the right moment." "No, James. I've been investing in myself all along, creating options rather than limitations. The difference might seem subtle to you, but it's fundamental to understanding why our marriage failed." After a long moment of tense silence, James reached for a pen. As he signed the acknowledgement, the balance of power in our relationship shifted irrevocably, not because of my hidden wealth, but because I had finally refused to remain invisible. When he and his attorney departed an hour later, I stood at the window watching their car disappear into Boston's evening traffic. 15 years of strategic silence had ended, giving way to a future where my success would no longer be concealed, for someone else's comfort. The invisible wife had finally stepped into view, and the financial world was about to discover exactly what they had been missing. The morning after James's departure, I woke to the familiar hum of the city beyond my window. Boston's financial district was coming alive with the rhythmic energy of ambition, bankers, analysts, and traders converging on glass towers to shift digital fortunes according to ancient patterns of fear and confidence. For 15 years, I had been part of that flow while remaining somehow apart from it, my true capabilities hidden beneath the acceptable veneer of executive spouse. That identity was now as empty as my joint checking account. I made coffee and settled at my home office desk, logging into the secure server housing Artemis Capital's operations. The various investment positions displayed on my monitor painted a complex financial portrait that would have surprised anyone who knew me. Only as Rebecca Westbrook, dutiful wife of an ascending Maxwell financial executive. Particularly surprising would have been the substantial position Artemis had established in Maxwell Financial's primary competitor, Harrison Global Partners. My secure phone chimed with a message from Margaret Chen, requesting an immediate call. I dialed her private line, curious about the urgency. "I hope I didn't wake you," Margaret began without preamble. "There have been developments overnight that require our attention." "I've been up for hours," I assured her. "What's happened?" "James has been quite busy since your confrontation yesterday. At 11:43 p.m., he attempted to liquidate several of your joint investment holdings. Fortunately, our preliminary injunction prevented those transactions from processing. At 2:17 a.m., he contacted Philip Maxwell to inform him that you are suffering from unspecified mental health issues that might impact your judgment." I absorbed this information without surprise. James's predictable moves confirmed that I had assessed his character correctly over our years together. And the most concerning development? At 8:05 this morning, he filed emergency motions requesting temporary control of all marital assets pending psychological evaluation. Margaret's tone remained professional despite the obvious absurdity of the claim. "His legal team is attempting to fast-track the hearing for tomorrow." "On what grounds?" "He's claiming your revelation about Artemis Capital constitutes evidence of financial deception and possibly criminal tax evasion. He's positioning himself as the responsible party, attempting to prevent further financial irregularities." I laughed softly, appreciating the irony. "He's using my financial success as evidence of my instability." "Essentially, yes. It's a desperate but potentially effective short-term strategy. Judges tend to maintain the status quo until facts can be established, which could temporarily restrict your access to personal accounts if he's convincing enough." "He won't be," I stated with quiet confidence. "Artemis Capital's structures have been meticulously documented and tax-compliant from inception. I have quarterly filings, audited statements, and full legal reviews supporting every transaction." "I anticipated as much," Margaret replied, her tone warming slightly. "Nevertheless, we should meet today to prepare our response. My office at noon? I'll be there." After ending the call, I finished my coffee while considering the chessboard James had established. His moves were aggressive but fundamentally reactive, designed to protect his position rather than strengthen it. Like many traders, he excelled at responding to market conditions, but struggled with long-term strategic thinking. My phone chimed again with an unfamiliar number. I answered cautiously. "Rebecca Westbrook?" A woman's crisp, authoritative voice came through the line. "Speaking." "This is Eleanor Harrison, CEO of Harrison Global Partners. I understand you're the beneficial owner of Artemis Capital." My pulse quickened slightly. Eleanor Harrison was a legend in Boston financial circles, one of the few women who had built a major investment firm from the ground up, rather than inheriting or marrying into the position. Her firm managed over $18 billion in assets and had been systematically capturing market share from old guard institutions like Maxwell Financial. "May I ask how you came by that information, Ms. Harrison?" I replied, neither confirming nor denying. "Let's just say that when a significant position in my company is established through a Singapore entity, I make it my business to understand who's behind the investment." A smile colored her voice. "Particularly when that entity demonstrates such remarkably consistent judgment in its positions." I remained silent, evaluating this unexpected development. Artemis had acquired approximately 3% of Harrison Global over the past 2 years. A substantial position, but not one that would typically warrant direct contact from the CEO. "I'd like to meet with you," Eleanor continued. "Today, if possible. There's a matter of mutual interest I believe we should discuss." The timing was too perfect to be coincidental. "Does this mutual interest involve Maxwell Financial's planned expansion into Singapore?" A short, appreciative laugh. "You are direct. I like that. Yes, Maxwell's announcement has created certain strategic considerations for firms like mine. Your perspective on those considerations could be valuable." "My perspective or my position?" I asked, cutting to the heart of the matter. "Both," Eleanor admitted frankly. Your investment record suggests exceptional insight into emerging markets. Your personal situation suggests potential alignment with my interests rather than Maxwell's. I'm proposing a conversation, not a commitment. I considered her offer. Against my schedule. I can meet at 3 p.m. There's a private room at the Gardner Tea House that offers appropriate discretion. Perfect. I look forward to meeting the woman behind Artemis Capital. As I prepared for the day ahead, I reflected on how quickly circumstances were evolving. 24 hours ago, I had been the invisible wife whose financial acumen remained her secret strength. Now that strength was becoming publicly known, creating both vulnerability and unprecedented opportunity. At noon, I arrived at Margaret Chen's offices in a converted Beacon Hill townhouse that balanced historic elegance with modern efficiency, much like Margaret herself. At 62, she had the polished presence of someone who had spent decades navigating Boston's intersecting spheres of wealth, power, and legal complexity. James's attorney has already contacted me 3 times this morning, she informed me as we settled in her sunlit conference room. They're pushing for an emergency hearing while simultaneously floating settlement offers. What kind of offers? I asked, accepting the tea her assistant provided. The amounts keep increasing, which tells me they're getting nervous. Margaret referenced her notes. The latest proposal offers $10 million in exchange for your silence regarding the affair, resignation of any claims against Maxwell Financial, and a substantial non-compete clause that would prevent you from working in financial services for 5 years. I raised an eyebrow. Up from $3 million yesterday. Interesting escalation. Indeed, they're particularly focused on that non-compete clause, which suggests they're concerned about something beyond the typical divorce considerations. Margaret studied me with practiced perception. Would that concern happen to involve Harrison Global Partners? The question confirmed why I had selected Margaret as my attorney. Her network of connections throughout Boston's financial community gave her access to information that rarely appeared in official documents. Eleanor Harrison contacted me this morning, I confirmed. We're meeting at 3. Margaret nodded, absorbing this information without visible reaction. Maxwell and Harrison have been circling each other for years. Philip Maxwell attempted to acquire Harrison Global when Eleanor's father died, assuming she would be eager to sell rather than take over leadership. That sounds like Philip, I noted. Underestimating women seems to be a Maxwell tradition. Eleanor refused the offer and proceeded to systematically target Maxwell's most profitable client segments. Margaret allowed herself a small smile. She's been remarkably effective. Maxwell's Singapore expansion is widely viewed as a defensive move to establish new revenue streams as their domestic business erodes. A defensive move built on James's lie about my supposed Asian connections, I added, the full picture becoming clearer. No wonder he's desperate to enforce that non-compete clause. If I were to join Harrison with my actual expertise and connections, it would be the corporate equivalent of leaving your husband for his worst enemy, Margaret finished, her expression thoughtful. Which raises important strategic considerations for our approach to the divorce proceedings. For the next hour, we developed our response to James's emergency motion, assembling documentation that not only refuted his claims about my financial activities, but established a pattern of his own suspicious behavior. Bank records showing his withdrawals from our joint accounts, credit card statements documenting expenses related to his affair, email exchanges with Maxwell's board containing demonstrably false claims about my family connections, all meticulously organized into a compelling counter-narrative. This should effectively neutralize his attempt to restrict your assets, Margaret concluded as we reviewed the final preparation. But we should discuss your meeting with Eleanor. Any substantial business arrangement with Harrison during divorce proceedings will complicate matters. I'm not planning to make any commitments today, I assured her. This is exploratory only. Margaret's expression remained concerned. Be careful, Rebecca. Eleanor Harrison didn't build her firm by being sentimental. She sees an opportunity in your situation, one that benefits her interests first and foremost. Just like everyone else in finance, I observed wryly. The difference is that Eleanor's interests might actually align with mine, at least temporarily. Just remember that temporary alignments can create permanent consequences, Margaret cautioned, especially when they involve choosing sides in a corporate rivalry as intense as Maxwell versus Harrison. I left Margaret's office with renewed clarity about the complex forces now intersecting around my divorce. What had begun as a private marital dissolution was expanding to involve corporate rivalries, investment strategies, and potential career realignments. The invisible wife was suddenly visible to multiple parties, each recognizing value that James had systematically diminished. The Gardner Tea House occupied the ground floor of a Victorian brownstone in Back Bay, its interior designed to facilitate discreet conversations among Boston's elite. I had selected it deliberately for my meeting with Eleanor, knowing its private rooms offered both security and neutral territory, neither Maxwell nor Harrison territory. Eleanor Harrison arrived precisely on time, her presence commanding immediate attention despite her average height and understated attire. In her mid-50s, she carried herself with the assured confidence of someone who had nothing left to prove, yet continued achieving from intrinsic motivation rather than external validation. "Rebecca," she greeted me, extending her hand. "Thank you for making time on what must be a complicated day." Her direct acknowledgement of my personal situation, without offering false sympathy or awkward avoidance, immediately established a tone of professional respect. "Complicated days often present unexpected clarity," I replied, gesturing toward the private room I had reserved. Once seated with tea service arranged between us, Eleanor dispensed with preliminary small talk. "I'll be direct, Rebecca. Maxwell's Singapore expansion threatens a market segment where Harrison has established significant positions over the past 3 years. Your husband's appointment to lead that expansion was surprising, given his limited international experience. The appointment makes more sense when you consider that the board believes his wife has extensive family connections in Singapore," I noted, watching her reaction carefully. Eleanor's expression registered immediate understanding. "Connections that don't actually exist." "Precisely." She stirred her tea thoughtfully. "That's a substantial misrepresentation to shareholders. One that will become difficult to maintain after our divorce becomes public," I added. "Which explains the aggressive legal maneuvers I've heard are already underway." Eleanor set her spoon aside. "Your husband is attempting to silence you through financial restrictions and non-compete clauses." I tilted my head slightly. "You seem remarkably well informed about my personal circumstances." Eleanor smiled. "Boston's financial community runs on information, Rebecca. When significant players make significant moves, people notice. Your situation has generated considerable attention over the past 24 hours. And that attention prompted your call this morning?" "Partly," she acknowledged. "But I've been following Artemis Capital's activities for over 2 years. Your investment strategies in emerging markets align remarkably well with Harrison's expansion priorities, particularly in Southeast Asia. The current situation simply created an opportunity to discuss mutual interests more directly." "What exactly are you proposing?" Eleanor reached into her portfolio and extracted a slim document. "Harrison Global Partners would like to acquire Artemis Capital, integrating your investment approach and positions into our international division. You would join Harrison as Managing Director of Emerging Markets, with full strategic authority over the portfolios you've developed. The compensation package includes equity participation structured to recognize the value you've already created." She slid the document across the table. I glanced at the terms outlined on the first page, noting the proposed valuation of Artemis Capital. The figure was substantial, recognizing not just the current asset value, but the intellectual property represented by my investment methodologies. "This is a generous offer," I observed, continuing to review the terms. particularly the accelerated timeline. You're proposing to complete this transaction within 30 days. The Singapore opportunity won't wait, Eleanor replied frankly. Maxwell is moving quickly to establish their presence. We need to counter with a decisive strategy that demonstrates superior capabilities in the region. Capabilities you believe I can provide. Capabilities you've already demonstrated. Through Artemis's performance, she corrected. The question is whether you're prepared to step from behind the curtain and operate publicly in a leadership role. The question penetrated to the heart of my current transition. For years, I had channeled my financial abilities through Artemis, precisely because it allowed me to operate without public scrutiny or direct competition with James. The prospect of stepping into a visible executive position at Maxwell's primary competitor represented a fundamental shift in my professional identity. Your timing suggests you're aware of my divorce proceedings, I noted, including the non-compete clauses James is attempting to enforce. Eleanor nodded. We have excellent legal counsel prepared to argue that such restrictions are unenforceable given the circumstances, particularly since you've maintained separate professional activities throughout your marriage. Making this offer while my divorce is pending creates complications, I pointed out. It could be perceived as deliberately provocative. To Maxwell and your husband? Undoubtedly. Eleanor's gaze remained steady. The question is whether those complications matter more than the opportunity before you. You've spent years building something remarkable through Artemis, Rebecca. Something few people have recognized or valued appropriately. I'm offering the chance to leverage that achievement on a much larger stage. The opportunity was undeniably compelling. Harrison Global Partners had the infrastructure, capital, and market position to multiply Artemis's impact exponentially. The compensation package would secure my financial independence regardless of divorce outcomes. The leadership role would establish immediate professional credibility in an industry where my capabilities had remained largely invisible. Yet something in Eleanor's presentation triggered my cautious assessment. The accelerated timeline, the emphasis on countering Maxwell's Singapore strategy, the willingness to entangle Harrison in my contentious divorce, all suggested motivations beyond simply acquiring Artemis's investment capabilities. Your offer is compelling, I acknowledged, closing the document. But it also serves your strategic interests in ways that extend beyond my investment approach. You're looking to disrupt Maxwell's expansion plans by undermining the credibility of their newly appointed executive and simultaneously acquiring expertise that directly counters their strategic direction. Eleanor's expression shifted from persuasive to appreciative. Most people would focus exclusively on the personal benefits of the offer. I'm not most people, I replied simply. Clearly not. She leaned back, reassessing me with increased respect. You're right, of course. Harrison stands to gain significant competitive advantage from this arrangement, beyond just your investment expertise. Maxwell's Singapore strategy depends heavily on the connections they believe you provide. Revealing those connections don't exist while simultaneously bringing your actual expertise to Harrison would devastate their expansion plans and investor confidence. Her candor was refreshing after years of James's calculated half-truths. At least we understand each other's motivations. Understanding doesn't preclude mutual benefit, Eleanor noted. Harrison offers the platform and resources to maximize your capabilities. You offer expertise and strategic positioning that strengthens our competitive position. The fact that this arrangement would complicate Maxwell's plans is, from my perspective, an added benefit rather than the primary motivation. I considered her words carefully, weighing the professional opportunity against the personal complications it would create. I appreciate your directness, Eleanor, and I'm genuinely interested in exploring this possibility. However, I won't make decisions of this magnitude while in the midst of divorce proceedings. I need to resolve my personal situation before establishing new professional commitments. Rather than pressing further, Eleanor nodded with unexpected understanding. A reasonable position. The offer remains open for 60 days, with the terms as presented. She rose, extending her hand once more. Regardless of your decision about Harrison, I hope you'll consider me an ally in your current transitions. Boston's financial community has too few women in positions of genuine authority. Those of us who have achieved such positions should support each other when possible. Even when competitive interests are involved? I asked, accepting her. Handshake. Especially then, she replied with a knowing smile. Competition doesn't preclude respect or selective collaboration. Remember that as you navigate the coming weeks. After Eleanor departed, I remained at the tea house, processing the unexpected opportunity she had presented. The Harrison offer represented exactly the kind of professional recognition I had privately desired but publicly sublimated during my marriage. It validated not just my investment performance, but my strategic thinking and market insights. Yet accepting it would transform my divorce from a private dissolution into a public corporate drama, potentially complicating both legal proceedings and my longer-term reputation in financial circles. It would cast me as a deliberate agent in Maxwell's competitive challenges rather than simply a spouse asserting her independence. As I considered these implications, my phone chimed with an incoming message, not from Margaret or Eleanor, but from Philip Maxwell himself. Rebecca, I've just heard disturbing reports about your situation with James. Please call me at your earliest convenience to discuss these matters privately before they impact the firm. The message confirmed what I had suspected. News of our marital dissolution was spreading through Boston's financial ecosystem, creating ripples of concern among those with interests in Maxwell Financial's stability. Philip's outreach suggested the narrative had not yet solidified. He was seeking to understand and potentially contain the situation before it affected investor confidence. Rather than responding immediately, I gathered my belongings and exited the tea house, choosing to walk through the public garden while organizing my thoughts. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across carefully maintained paths as Boston's diverse residents enjoyed the urban sanctuary. Families with children, students with textbooks, professionals seeking brief escape from office confines. Among them, I was just another figure moving through dappled light, no longer invisible, but not yet fully seen in the professional capability I had cultivated. The coming days would determine whether that capability would remain private or emerge into public recognition, whether my financial acumen would become a weapon in corporate rivalry or a foundation for independent achievement. The question wasn't whether opportunities existed. Eleanor's offer had confirmed they did. The question was which opportunity best served my long-term interests, rather than just immediate vindication. Which path would transform personal crisis into sustainable triumph rather than merely temporary advantage? As I reached the garden's edge, my phone chimed again with a message from Margaret Chen. Judge has denied James's emergency motion. All your personal accounts remain accessible. Hearing scheduled for Friday regarding temporary financial arrangements during divorce proceedings. The first legal battle had been decided in my favor, a small but significant victory establishing that James's claims about my financial activities lacked sufficient evidence to justify emergency intervention. The courts had implicitly recognized my right to maintain separate financial interests, despite James's attempts to characterize them as deceptive or unstable. With this immediate threat neutralized, I could approach the broader landscape of opportunities with strategic patience rather than reactive urgency. Eleanor's offer would remain viable. Philip's concerns could be addressed from a position of strength rather than vulnerability. James's attempts to restrict my options had failed in their first significant test. I texted Margaret a brief acknowledgement, then continued walking toward my apartment. The unexpected opportunity presented by Eleanor Harrison had fundamentally altered my position, confirming that my financial capabilities were recognized and valued by those whose judgment carried weight in Boston's investment community. Whether I ultimately accepted Harrison's specific offer, its existence had transformed the dynamics of my situation. The invisible wife had not only become visible but actively sought after, her previously hidden talents now recognized as valuable, strategic assets. The world that had once viewed me primarily as James Westbrook's supportive spouse was beginning to perceive the full spectrum of my capabilities. That recognition created leverage, not just in divorce proceedings, but in reshaping my professional identity beyond the constraints of a marriage that had required perpetual diminishment. The opportunity before me wasn't simply financial independence or professional validation, but the freedom to define success on my own terms, rather than through the reflected achievement of someone else. As I reached my building, I made a decision about Philip Maxwell's message. Rather than calling immediately, I would request a formal meeting tomorrow at Maxwell Financial's offices, establishing both professional courtesy and personal boundary. This conversation wouldn't happen on Philip's terms or timeline, but as an engagement between equals with mutual concerns about the situation James had created. The unexpected opportunity wasn't just Eleanor's offer or Philip's outreach, it was the fundamental shift in positioning that occurred when I stopped accepting invisibility and began asserting my actual value. That shift had created options where previously only constraints had existed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as James and his allies adjusted their strategy. But for the first time in 15 years, I would meet those challenges as Rebecca, the financial strategist, not Rebecca, the supportive wife. The difference would prove more consequential than anyone anticipated, perhaps even me. The following morning, I dressed with deliberate intention for my meeting with Philip Maxwell, selecting a charcoal Armani suit that projected authority without ostentation. For 15 years, I had carefully curated my appearance for Maxwell financial events to complement James, rather than command attention independently. Today's selection served a different purpose, establishing my presence as a financial professional, rather than a corporate spouse. As my car service approached the gleaming tower housing Maxwell Financial, I mentally prepared for the conversation ahead. Philip Maxwell had built his firm through astute relationship management as much as investment acumen. At 73, he maintained iron control over the organization despite nominal leadership transitions to younger executives. His request to speak privately about my situation with James revealed both concern about implications for his firm and confidence in his ability to shape outcomes through personal intervention. The executive reception area on the 45th floor welcomed me with the hushed deference Maxwell cultivated for its most significant clients and partners. The receptionist, who had greeted me at countless corporate functions without truly registering my presence, now viewed me with uncertain recategorization. Was I still James's wife deserving courteous recognition, or had I become something else requiring different handling? "Mrs. Westbrook," she began hesitantly, "Mr. Maxwell is expecting you in the chairman's office." "Thank you, Claire," I replied, noting her surprise at my knowledge of her name. "And it's Ms. Miller now. I've resumed my professional name." The statement established immediate boundaries for the conversation ahead. I wasn't entering Maxwell Financial as James's extension, but as an independent entity reasserting her separate identity. Philip's assistant escorted me through mahogany-paneled corridors to the chairman's suite, a corner space designed to impress with panoramic views and carefully calibrated displays of institutional permanence. Philip himself rose from behind, his substantial desk as I entered, his expression balancing practiced cordiality with evident concern. "Rebecca, thank you for coming," he began, gesturing toward a seating area arranged for conversation rather than negotiation. "I appreciate your willingness to discuss these sensitive matters directly." I took the offered seat, noting how he had positioned himself in the dominant chair, slightly higher, angled to maximize his imposing presence against the backdrop of Boston's financial district spread below his windows. "Your message suggested urgency, Philip. I'm curious about what aspects of my personal situation warrant the attention of Maxwell Financial's chairman." My directness momentarily disrupted his practiced rhythm. Philip had anticipated starting with general pleasantries before navigating toward difficult subjects. My immediate focus on substance shifted his approach. "I've received concerning reports about developments between you and James," he stated, recalibrating. "Allegations of financial improprieties, unexpected legal maneuvers, and potential impacts on our Singapore expansion plans. Given James's critical role in our international strategy, these developments obviously warrant my attention." "What specific allegations concern you most?" I asked, maintaining neutral engagement while assessing which narratives had reached him. Philip hesitated, measuring his response. "There are suggestions that you've been operating undisclosed investment activities that may create conflicts with Maxwell's interests. James has expressed concern about your stability and judgment regarding these activities." "I see," I replied calmly. "And has James also disclosed his emptying of our joint accounts? His relationship with his assistant? Or his misrepresentations to your board regarding my non-existent family connections in Singapore?" The slight widening of Philip's eyes confirmed my suspicion. James had provided a carefully edited version of our situation, emphasizing aspects that positioned him as the responsible party while omitting his own misconduct. "Those are serious counter-allegations," Philip noted carefully. "Though I'm not certain that personal matters between spouses fall within my purview as chairman." "They do when those personal matters involve fraudulent representations to investors and the board," I countered. "James secured his position, leading Maxwell Global by claiming access to family connections I don't possess. That's not a marital disagreement, Philip. It's securities fraud." Philip's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "That characterization seems extreme. James may have been optimistic about relationship development opportunities, but—" "He lied," I interrupted firmly. "Not about potential opportunities, but about existing relationships. He specifically claimed that my family has established business connections in Singapore that would facilitate Maxwell's market entry. My family has no such connections." For a moment, Philip seemed caught between institutional defense and personal reassessment. "These are complicated matters that require careful consideration, Rebecca. I've known James for over a decade. His judgment and integrity have always been convenient for Maxwell's interests," I finished. "I understand loyalty to your executives, Philip, but my concern isn't James's career trajectory. It's the fact that Maxwell Financial is proceeding with a significant international expansion based partially on misrepresentations that will inevitably be exposed during our divorce proceedings." My statement hung between us, its implications impossible to dismiss. Philip Maxwell hadn't built a multi-billion-dollar financial institution without recognizing existential threats when they appeared. "What exactly are you suggesting?" he asked, his tone recalibrating to evaluate me as a potential adversary rather than a distraught spouse. "I'm not suggesting anything," I replied evenly. "I'm directly stating that Maxwell's Singapore strategy is built on a fundamental misrepresentation. That will become public record during divorce proceedings. How shareholders, regulators, and clients respond to that revelation is beyond my control or concern." Philip studied me with new attention, reassessing the woman before him against his previous categorization. "You've changed, Rebecca." "I don't. Recall this directness in our previous interactions." "I haven't changed, Philip. You're simply seeing aspects of me that weren't visible or relevant in my role as James's wife." I leaned forward slightly. "The financial strategist who built Artemis Capital has always existed alongside the corporate spouse who attended your charity galas." "Artemis Capital," he repeated slowly. "The Singapore-based investment firm that's established substantial positions in emerging Asian markets over the past 8 years. His knowledge of Artemis confirmed that Philip's information networks extended far beyond what James might have shared. Maxwell's chairman had conducted his own due diligence before our meeting. "The same," I acknowledged. Though I'm curious how that information reached you, given the carefully structured privacy of Artemis's ownership. Philip allowed himself a thin smile. Boston's financial community is smaller than it appears, Rebecca. Significant capital movements eventually create ripples that reach shore, regardless of how far offshore they originate. And James's accusations about my undisclosed investment activities prompted you to investigate those ripples more closely, I concluded. Prudent risk management requires understanding all factors that might impact Maxwell's interests, Philip confirmed without apology. Artemis has established several positions that directly compete with Maxwell's strategic priorities in Asian markets. Given your marriage to our executive responsible for those markets, the potential conflict of interest is obvious. A conflict that disappears entirely once our divorce is finalized, I pointed out. Which makes the timing of your Singapore expansion particularly unfortunate. Philip's expression hardened slightly. If you're implying that the divorce timing was deliberate to disrupt Maxwell's plans. I'm not implying anything about timing, I corrected him. James's infidelity and financial misconduct determined the divorce timing. My concern is Maxwell's continued advancement of a strategy built on misrepresentation despite emerging evidence of its fundamental flaws. What evidence would that be beyond your marital disagreements? I reached into my portfolio and extracted a carefully prepared document, a comprehensive analysis of Maxwell's proposed Singapore strategy compared against actual market conditions and competitive positioning in the region. This assessment identifies 12 critical weaknesses in Maxwell's current approach, independent of any questions about James's leadership or representations. The strategy overestimates available market share, underestimates established competitive positions, and fails to account for regulatory changes implemented last quarter. Philip accepted the document with visible surprise, scanning its contents with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to absorbing complex financial analyses quickly. His expression shifted from skepticism to reluctant recognition as he processed the detailed critique. This analysis reflects proprietary information about our strategic positioning, he noted, a question embedded in his observation. It reflects my independent assessment based on publicly available information and Artemis's market research, I corrected. The fact that it aligns with your internal perspectives simply confirms its accuracy. Philip set the document aside, his appraising gaze now fully focused on me rather than the situation I represented. You've presented a compelling case that our Singapore strategy faces challenges we may have underestimated. What remains unclear is your purpose in sharing this assessment. What outcome are you seeking from this conversation, Rebecca? The question revealed Philip's fundamental approach to conflict resolution, identifying the other party's objectives to facilitate appropriate concessions or counteroffers. It was the mindset that had made him an effective negotiator throughout his career. I'm not seeking any specific outcome from Maxwell Financial, I replied truthfully. My purpose was ensuring you have accurate information about both my situation with James and the implications for your Singapore strategy. What actions you take with that information are entirely your decision. Philip's expression suggested he didn't entirely accept my stated motivation. Most people in contentious divorce proceedings involving a senior executive would leverage this type of information for financial advantage. I'm not most people, I stated simply, and I don't need financial leverage from Maxwell to secure appropriate settlements from James. My own resources are more than sufficient. This statement, delivered without embellishment or defensive qualification, visibly shifted Philip's assessment. The woman before him was neither seeking revenge against a straying husband, nor financial extraction from his employer. My motivations existed outside the familiar patterns he had navigated throughout his career. You present a unique perspective, Rebecca, Philip acknowledged after a thoughtful pause. One that I confess I failed to recognize during our previous interactions over the years. The outsider's perspective often sees what those immersed in existing systems overlook, I observed. My position at the periphery of Maxwell's operations, visible but not integrated, created unique insights that wouldn't be available to someone fully embedded within your organizational culture. Philip nodded slowly, accepting the observation, without defensiveness. And now that outsider perspective has been shared, the question becomes what happens next. That depends entirely on how you choose to proceed with the Singapore expansion and James's leadership role, I replied. My divorce will continue regardless, with full disclosure of relevant facts during proceedings. Including James's misrepresentations about your family connections? Including all material facts affecting our marital assets and separation. Terms, I confirmed, neither threatening specific disclosures nor promising discretion. Philip rose and moved to the window, surveying the financial district spread below, the visible manifestation of the system he had helped build and maintain throughout his career. When he turned back, his expression had settled into thoughtful calculation. I'd like to propose an alternative approach, he began carefully, one that might serve multiple interests simultaneously. I'm listening. Maxwell Financial could benefit from your market insights regarding Singapore and broader Asian opportunities, particularly given the concerns you've identified in our current strategy. Your analysis suggests capabilities that align with our needs, independent of any connections to James. I maintained neutral engagement, allowing him to continue developing his proposition. I'd like you to consider a consulting arrangement with Maxwell, specifically with our international strategy team, separate from James's operational responsibilities. Your perspective as an outsider with demonstrated success in these markets would be valuable as we refine our approach. The offer was unexpected, but not entirely surprising. Philip had built his career by converting potential adversaries into allies when possible. If my insights represented legitimate value, he would prefer to secure them for Maxwell's benefit, rather than allow them to strengthen competitors or remain independently deployed. An interesting proposition, I acknowledged, though it raises several obvious complications, such as: for one, any consulting arrangement with Maxwell would need to be established after my divorce is finalized to avoid creating new entanglements during proceedings. For another, it would require appropriate disclosures regarding Artemis Capital's existing positions to address potential conflicts of interest. Philip nodded, accepting these parameters. Reasonable conditions. Would you be open to such an arrangement in principle, assuming appropriate timing and disclosure requirements? I considered his offer against my evolving objectives. The prospect of engaging with Maxwell as a recognized expert rather than a marginalized spouse offered a form of professional validation I hadn't anticipated. It would establish my market insights as valuable independent of my marriage, potentially creating new opportunities beyond the immediate consulting arrangement. I would consider such an arrangement under the right conditions, I confirmed, though I should note that I've received other offers that would preclude consulting with Maxwell due to competitive conflicts. Philip's expression sharpened with immediate recognition. Harrison Global. I neither confirmed nor denied, allowing his assumption to stand uncontested. Eleanor Harrison moves quickly when she perceives advantage, Philip observed, a note of grudging respect in his tone. Though I'm surprised she would approach you during active divorce proceedings involving a Maxwell executive. The financial world rarely allows perfect timing, I replied diplomatically. Opportunities emerge when circumstances create them, not when all conditions are ideal. Philip acknowledged this reality with a slight nod. Indeed. Which is why I'm proposing this potential arrangement now, despite the obvious complications. Talent and insight are rare enough to warrant navigating difficult circumstances when they become available. His characterization of my capabilities as talent and insight, rather than problems or threats, marked a significant evolution in his perspective. The outsider he had previously overlooked was now being actively courted for the very qualities that had rendered her invisible within. Maxwell's traditional hierarchy. I appreciate your perspective, Philip, and I'll give your proposal appropriate consideration once my personal situation allows for new professional arrangements. I rose, signaling the conclusion of our meeting. In the meantime, I recommend reviewing your Singapore strategy with particular attention to the vulnerabilities identified in my analysis. Even without my formal involvement, addressing those weaknesses would strengthen Maxwell's competitive position. Philip accepted the implicit conclusion, rising to escort me to the door. Your candor today has been unexpectedly valuable, Rebecca. Whatever arrangements eventually emerge, I hope we'll maintain open communication as your situation evolves. Transparency serves everyone's interests at this point, I agreed. Though I should note that my candor with you today doesn't extend to discussing Maxwell's internal matters with competitors or other external parties. My discretion regarding sensitive information remains intact, despite my changing relationship with James. The assurance, offered without being requested, visibly relieved a tension Philip had maintained throughout our meeting. My recognition of appropriate professional boundaries despite personal grievances reassured him of my fundamental character in ways that benefited both our interests. As I departed Maxwell Financial's headquarters, I reflected on the remarkable transformation that had occurred within those mahogany-paneled offices. I had entered as Rebecca Westbrook, problematic spouse of a valuable executive, potentially threatening Maxwell's strategic interests through messy divorce proceedings. I had departed as Rebecca Miller, financial strategist with valuable market insights, being actively recruited for my professional capabilities despite complicated personal circumstances. The outsider's perspective that had developed during years of peripheral observation had suddenly become centrally valuable, not because it had changed, but because others now recognized its worth. The invisibility that had limited my professional recognition had simultaneously allowed me to develop insights unavailable to those operating within established systems and assumptions. My phone chimed with a message from Margaret Chen. Meeting with James's attorneys scheduled for 3 p.m. New settlement offer proposed. Significant increase from previous terms. The timing suggested Philip had already communicated with James following our meeting. The increased settlement offer likely reflected new understanding of both my financial position and potential impact on Maxwell's interests. James was attempting to resolve the situation quickly before further complications emerged. Rather than responding immediately, I directed my driver to Elaine Porter's office in Cambridge. As my original mentor in finance and the first person to recognize my investment potential, Elaine represented a perspective uncontaminated by either James's manipulation or current corporate maneuvering. Her wisdom had guided my early career decisions. I needed her balanced assessment of the rapidly evolving opportunities before me. Elaine welcomed me into her modest office at Porter Investment Advisors, the boutique firm she had established after leaving institutional finance 20 years earlier. At 68, she had deliberately scaled back her client roster to focus exclusively on women building independent wealth, a specialized practice that generated sufficient income while allowing her to mentor selected protégés like me. "Rebecca," she greeted me warmly, embracing me briefly before gesturing toward comfortable chairs arranged near her window overlooking the Charles River. "I've been expecting your call since hearing about developments with James. Though I must admit, the specifics have exceeded even my expectations." I smiled, unsurprised by her awareness of current events. News travels quickly in Boston finance, particularly when it involves Maxwell's Singapore strategy, Harrison's recruitment efforts, and a $47 million offshore investment firm that suddenly emerges from obscurity, Elaine agreed with characteristic directness. "You've created quite the stir in traditionally placid waters." "Not intentionally," I noted. I was perfectly content maintaining separation between my marriage and investment activities until James's actions forced disclosure. Elaine studied me thoughtfully, her expression balancing concern with approval. And now that disclosure has occurred, you're facing multiple paths forward, which is why you're here, I suspect. Over the next hour, I detailed recent developments: James's misconduct and financial maneuvers, Eleanor Harrison's acquisition offer, Philip Maxwell's consulting proposal, and the rapidly increasing settlement offers from James's attorneys. Elaine listened without interruption, her decades of financial experience allowing her to absorb complex scenarios efficiently. "You've positioned yourself remarkably well," she observed when I concluded. "The question isn't whether you have viable options. You clearly do. The question is which option best serves your long-term interests rather than just immediate validation." "Exactly," I agreed. Eleanor's offer provides immediate professional recognition and significant financial upside. Philip's proposal offers influential connections within established institutions. Both leverage my capabilities in ways my marriage never permitted. And both involve aligning yourself with specific corporate interests during a transitional period in your life, Elaine noted cautiously. Decisions made during such transitions often reflect immediate emotional needs rather than enduring values. Her observation penetrated to the heart of my current dilemma. The opportunities emerging from my marital dissolution offered professional validation I had long desired, recognition of capabilities that James had systematically minimized throughout our marriage. The temptation to embrace whichever option most visibly refuted his diminishment was powerful. "You're suggesting I might be drawn to these opportunities for the wrong reasons," I acknowledged. "I'm suggesting that vindication is a poor foundation for career decisions," Elaine clarified. "The question isn't which option proves James wrong about your capabilities. The question is which path allows those capabilities to develop most fully according to your own definition of success." Her framing shifted my perspective subtly but significantly. I had been evaluating options primarily through their relationship to my past constraints, which opportunity most completely rejected the limitations James had imposed. Elaine was redirecting my focus toward future possibilities independent of those former constraints. "When I established Artemis Capital," I reflected, "the structure was designed for privacy rather than growth potential. I created systems that protected my independent activities from James's awareness or interference. Those systems served their purpose effectively, but they also limited Artemis's development in certain ways." "Precisely," Elaine nodded. "Your investment strategy has been brilliant, but your organizational structure was defensive rather than expansive. The question now is whether Harrison's or Maxwell's established structures would enhance your capabilities or simply replace one set of constraints with another." The insight crystallized my thinking. Both corporate offers represented paths that would integrate my capabilities into existing systems designed by others for their specific purposes, while both offered resources and recognition I hadn't previously accessed. Neither fully embraced the unique perspective I had developed as an outsider to traditional financial hierarchies. "There's a third option," I said slowly, the possibilities crystallizing as I spoke. "One that preserves the independence that made Artemis successful while creating structures designed for growth rather than concealment." Elaine smiled with evident approval. "I was wondering when you'd consider that alternative. Transforming Artemis from a private investment vehicle into a proper institutional asset manager," I continued, the vision expanding as I articulated it. "Leveraging the track record and methodologies I've established to attract institutional capital seeking emerging market exposure. Building an organization aligned with my investment philosophy rather than adapting to existing corporate cultures at Harrison or Maxwell. A significantly greater challenge than accepting either corporate offer," Elaine noted, testing my resolve rather than discouraging the direction. "Building an institutional investment firm requires capital, connections, and credibility, particularly for a woman without the typical pedigree of family wealth or major firm leadership experience." All true, I acknowledged. But I have capital from Artemis's existing success. I have connections through my Harvard network and professional relationships developed over 15 years. And I have credibility through documented investment performance that outpaces most established competitors in emerging markets. Elaine leaned forward, her expression intensifying. You also have something more valuable, the outsider's perspective that identified opportunities others missed. That perspective emerged precisely because you operated beyond established systems. Preserving it requires maintaining appropriate distance from those same systems, even as you build new structures to leverage your insights. Her validation of the outsider's fundamental value resonated deeply. The capabilities I had developed while invisible to Boston's financial establishment weren't merely compensatory adaptations to marital constraints. They represented genuinely advantageous perspectives unavailable to those fully embedded within traditional hierarchies. So you think I should decline both Harrison's and Maxwell's offers? I asked, testing the implications of this direction. I think you should recognize them for what they are, attempts to capture your outsider perspective within insider systems. Elaine replied carefully. The question is whether your unique insights would thrive or diminish within those systems. Only you can answer that question, based on honest assessment of your priorities and capabilities. As I left Elaine's office an hour later, her perspective had fundamentally altered my evaluation of emerging opportunities. The outsider status I had initially viewed as a limitation imposed by my marriage now appeared as a potential strategic advantage in reshaping my professional identity. The question wasn't which existing corporate structure would best accommodate my capabilities, but whether those capabilities might form the foundation for something entirely new. With this reorientation, I headed toward my meeting with Margaret Chen and James's attorneys, newly confident in my position. The settlement offers, Harrison's acquisition proposal, and Maxwell's consulting arrangement all represented options within existing systems. But the outsider's perspective I had cultivated over 15 years might ultimately prove most valuable when deployed beyond those systems entirely. The invisible wife had not only become visible, she had developed unique vision. That vision could now be directed toward creating new possibilities rather than merely escaping old constraints. The conference room at Margaret Chen's law office carried none of the architectural intimidation of Maxwell Financial's headquarters. Instead, it offered neutral functionality, a medium-sized table surrounded by comfortable chairs, walls lined with discreetly framed credentials rather than imposing artwork, and windows providing natural light without panoramic power displays. This deliberate design created a space where substance could dominate over status, qualities that had made Margaret my preferred counsel. I arrived 20 minutes before the scheduled meeting, reviewing strategy with Margaret while we awaited James and his legal team. The latest settlement offer has increased to $18 million, Margaret observed, scanning the documents prepared by James's attorneys. Plus, continued residence in the Cambridge property and a significantly reduced non-compete clause limiting restrictions to Singapore markets only for 2 years rather than global financial services for 5. The escalation pattern is telling, I noted. From 3 million to 10 million to 18 million in less than 72 hours. They're responding to information rather than negotiating from principle. Margaret nodded, her experience detecting the same pattern. Specifically, they're responding to your meeting with Philip Maxwell this morning. James's attorneys contacted me less than an hour after you left Maxwell Financial's offices. Philip must have communicated concerns about potential impacts on their Singapore strategy, I concluded. They're trying to contain the situation quickly before it affects investor confidence. Which gives us considerable leverage if approached correctly, Margaret agreed. However, I should caution that settlement negotiations at this stage are primarily positioning rather than final terms. James's team will likely present this offer as generous while maintaining significant protections for his interests and Maxwell's strategic priorities. My response was interrupted by her assistant announcing the arrival of James's contingent. James entered first, accompanied by two attorneys, Bradford Wilson, a senior partner from Boston's oldest corporate law firm, and a younger associate, whose purpose appeared to be managing documents rather than contributing substantively. The contrast between James's current demeanor and his confident dismissal days earlier was striking. His customary polish remained intact, bespoke suit perfectly tailored, tie precisely knotted, hair immaculately groomed, but subtle indicators revealed underlying strain. The slight tightness around his eyes, the barely perceptible tension in his jaw, the fractional delay in his practiced smile as he registered my composed presence across the table. "Rebecca," he acknowledged with careful neutrality. "You're looking well." "James," I returned the greeting with equal restraint. "Shall we proceed directly to business? I assume everyone's time is valuable." Bradford Wilson took control of the conversation, establishing the professional tone expected from a high-level attorney representing significant interests. "Ms. Miller, we've prepared a comprehensive settlement proposal that we believe fairly addresses the dissolution of your marriage to Mr. Westbrook while respecting both parties' professional concerns." He slid an elegant leather folder across the table. Margaret intercepted it before I could reach for it, maintaining the proper procedural boundaries of represented negotiation. "Before we discuss specific terms," Margaret responded, "I'd like to clarify certain factual matters that impact any potential settlement." "Of course," Wilson agreed smoothly, though his eyes narrowed slightly at the preemptive redirection. "My client has provided documentation establishing that Mr. Westbrook unilaterally emptied joint accounts containing approximately $3 million without notice or consent," Margaret began. "Additionally, he has attempted to restrict her access to personal financial accounts through emergency court filings containing demonstrably false allegations regarding her mental state and financial activities." Wilson maintained his professional composure. "Those actions were taken based on Mr. Westbrook's legitimate concerns about unusual financial activities discovered during a difficult personal transition. The court has already addressed those concerns, and we're prepared to move forward constructively." "Moving forward constructively requires acknowledging misconduct rather than reframing it as legitimate concern," Margaret countered firmly. "The foundational facts of this dissolution include Mr. Westbrook's extended affair with his executive assistant and his misappropriation of joint funds, both of which preceded any legal proceedings." James shifted uncomfortably as his personal behavior entered the formal record. Wilson placed a steadying hand on his client's arm, a subtle command to maintain composure. "Personal grievances often complicate divorce proceedings unnecessarily," Wilson noted. "Our proposal addresses financial matters generously precisely to move beyond emotional considerations toward practical resolution." "Practical resolution requires factual accuracy," I interjected, speaking directly for the first time, "including acknowledgement that I maintained separate professional activities throughout our marriage, with documented compliance regarding all tax and disclosure requirements. The characterization of those activities as unusual or concerning represents a deliberate attempt to establish false narrative rather than engage with documented reality." James leaned forward, unable to maintain his silent observer role. "Reality includes your systematic concealment of significant financial activities from your husband for years, Rebecca. Activities that directly competed with my professional responsibilities at Maxwell. My investment activities never violated any confidentiality obligations regarding Maxwell Financial," I replied evenly. "And Massachusetts remains an equitable distribution state rather than community property. My separate property established prior to and maintained independently during marriage remains separate under law." Wilson intervened smoothly, recognizing the conversation's potentially damaging direction. "These legal distinctions can be addressed through appropriate documentation during settlement. The proposal before you acknowledges your right to maintain separate professional activities while providing generous compensation for contributions to the marriage. Margaret had been reviewing the settlement documents during this exchange. She looked up with practiced neutrality. This proposal includes extensive non-disclosure provisions regarding Maxwell Financial's business strategies, particularly relating to Singapore markets. It also requires my client to make specific representations to Philip Maxwell, disavowing any previous statements regarding misrepresentations about family connections in the region. Her summary exposed the proposal's true purpose: not equitable dissolution of marriage, but protection of Maxwell's strategic interests from potential fallout from James's misrepresentations. Standard confidentiality protections in executive divorces, Wilson characterized dismissively. Nothing unusual given Mr. Westbrook's position. What is unusual, Margaret noted precisely, is expecting my client to affirmatively misrepresent facts to protect Mr. Westbrook's employer from consequences of his documented deception. Such requirements extend well beyond standard confidentiality into potential complicity in securities violations. James's facade of professional detachment cracked. This is absurd. My representations to the board about potential market connections were forward-looking statements about business development, not fraudulent claims. You specifically stated that my family had established business connections in Singapore that would facilitate Maxwell's market entry, I reminded him calmly. You knew those connections didn't exist when you made those representations. That's not forward-looking business development. It's deliberate misrepresentation to secure professional advancement. Wilson intervened again, regaining control of the increasingly problematic conversation. These characterizations of internal corporate communications are precisely why confidentiality provisions are necessary. Divorces often involve emotional interpretations of business matters best addressed within corporate governance structures rather than family court. Corporate governance becomes relevant when family court proceedings reveal potential securities violations, Margaret observed. My client has no desire to create complications for Maxwell Financial beyond those already established by Mr. Westbrook's actions. However, she cannot agree to provisions that require her to affirmatively misrepresent facts or conceal potential violations from appropriate oversight. The statement established clear boundaries while implicitly acknowledging multiple resolution paths, an elegant demonstration of Margaret's strategic approach to high-stakes negotiations. Wilson recognized the implied opening. Perhaps we should focus on core settlement terms while restructuring confidentiality provisions to address legitimate concerns about required representations. The conversation shifted to specific financial terms, with Margaret methodically identifying provisions requiring modification. Throughout this technical discussion, I maintained attentive silence, allowing my counsel to manage procedural negotiations while I observed James's reactions. His initial confidence had eroded progressively as the meeting advanced. The settlement offer he had assumed would resolve the situation through financial inducement had instead exposed the fundamental weakness in his position, his need for my cooperation extending beyond dissolution of our marriage into protection of his professional standing. After nearly an hour of detailed negotiation, Margaret steered the conversation toward conclusion. We'll review these terms and provide a formal response within 48 hours. However, I should note that my client has received alternative offers that may impact her decision regarding this proposal. Wilson's expression revealed professional curiosity. Alternative offers regarding marital dissolution seem unusual. Alternative professional opportunities, Margaret clarified, which may influence her perspective on proposed non-compete provisions and confidentiality requirements. James could no longer maintain his facade of detached professionalism. You've been negotiating with Harrison Global, he stated flatly, the accusation reflecting his assumption about my intentions rather than confirmed knowledge. I've been exploring options appropriate to my investment expertise and market experience, I replied neutrally, as anyone would when establishing independent professional identity following divorce. After 15 years of marriage, your first independent move would be joining Maxwell's primary competitor? James challenged, his tone revealing the personal affront he perceived in my potential professional choices. My first independent move was establishing Artemis Capital 8 years ago, I corrected him. Something you failed to notice despite supposedly intimate knowledge of my activities and interests. My current considerations simply reflect evolving opportunities created by changed circumstances. Wilson intervened before James could respond, recognizing the increasingly counterproductive direction. We should conclude today's discussion and allow both parties to review proposed terms independently. Additional negotiations can be scheduled once initial positions are established. As the meeting formally ended and James's legal team gathered their materials, I remained seated, maintaining composed professionalism while they prepared to depart. James lingered behind his attorneys, clearly wanting private communication despite the obvious professional risks of unrepresented exchange. Rebecca, he began once his counsel had stepped into the hallway, voice lowered to prevent their overhearing. This adversarial approach benefits neither of us. We built 15 years together. Surely we can find resolution without scorched earth tactics. The appeal might have seemed reasonable to outside observers unaware of context. To me, it represented continued manipulation, characterizing my legitimate enforcement of boundaries as unreasonable aggression, while positioning his perspective as the rational middle ground. Acknowledging documented facts isn't adversarial. James, I replied calmly. Expecting me to protect you from consequences of your own actions isn't reasonable resolution. It's continued exploitation. The difference is that I'm no longer participating in that dynamic. His expression hardened, the mask of reasonable reconciliation dropping to reveal the calculation beneath. You realize this path potentially damages both our reputations? Financial communities have long memories for messy public divorces. They also have mechanisms for distinguishing between parties who operated with integrity and those who didn't, I noted. I'm comfortable with that evaluation process and its likely outcomes. The statement carried no overt threat, yet James received it as confirmation of my willingness to allow full disclosure of his conduct despite potential reputational impacts. His final attempt at leveraging my concern for professional standing had failed as definitively as his previous financial inducements. We could have had so much more together, he said finally, an ambiguous statement that might have referred to our marriage, professional collaboration, or financial outcomes. We had exactly what you were capable of creating, I responded, rising, to signal the conversation's conclusion. A relationship built on calculated advantage rather than genuine partnership. I'm no longer investing in that particular financial model. After James departed, Margaret returned to the conference room, settling across from me with the thoughtful expression that preceded her most valuable insights. That was illuminating, she observed. Particularly James's evident concern about your potential relationship with Harrison Global. His anxiety suggests Maxwell considers that specific possibility particularly threatening. Maxwell's Singapore strategy depends on capabilities they don't currently possess, I explained. James's claims about my family connections were meant to address that deficiency. If Harrison acquired Artemis's actual regional expertise while exposing those claims as fraudulent, Maxwell would face both competitive disadvantage and potential regulatory scrutiny. Creating significant leverage in settlement negotiations, Margaret concluded. Though leveraging that position requires careful balancing of legitimate interests against potentially vindictive outcomes. I have no interest in vindictive outcomes, I clarified. My priority is establishing appropriate independence without unnecessary entanglements or restrictions. If that can be accomplished through reasonable settlement terms, I prefer that approach to protracted conflict. Margaret nodded approvingly. A practical perspective that serves your interests better than emotional responses. regardless of how justified those emotions might be. However, I'm curious about your actual intentions regarding Harrison's offer. James's concern suggests specific knowledge beyond general competitive awareness. Philip Maxwell likely informed him about my meeting with Eleanor Harrison, I explained. Boston's financial community maintains surprisingly effective information networks, particularly regarding potential executive movements between competing firms. And your actual intentions regarding those potential movements? Margaret pressed gently. I shared my evolving perspective following discussions with Elaine Porter. I'm considering a third option beyond either corporate affiliation, transforming Artemis from private investment vehicle to institutional asset manager. Leveraging my track record and methodologies to attract capital-seeking emerging market exposure through a firm structured around my investment philosophy rather than adapting to existing corporate cultures. Margaret absorbed this direction thoughtfully. An ambitious alternative requiring significant infrastructure development beyond current operations. Though your existing capital position certainly supports such expansion if properly structured. The question isn't resource availability but strategic alignment, I noted. Whether my investment approach would be more effective within established organizational structures at Harrison or Maxwell, or through purpose-built systems designed specifically around my methodologies. This consideration changes our negotiation. Priorities regarding settlement terms, Margaret observed. Non-compete restrictions become less relevant if you're not joining direct competitors, while intellectual property protections for your investment methodologies become more significant if you're establishing independent operations. Her immediate grasp of strategic implications confirmed why I had selected Margaret as counsel. Her perspective extended beyond immediate legal process to encompass broader business considerations affecting client interests. Exactly, I confirmed. I need settlement terms that provide appropriate operational freedom, without unnecessary restrictions or entanglements, regardless of which professional direction ultimately proves most viable. Margaret made several notes before looking up. With renewed focus. This perspective positions us effectively for responding to James's settlement offer. We can propose modified terms that protect your legitimate interests while presenting reasonable accommodations regarding Maxwell's concerns about competitive information, provided those accommodations don't require misrepresentation or improper concealment. The approach perfectly balanced principled boundaries with practical negotiation, rejecting problematic provisions while offering reasonable alternatives that served legitimate interests on both sides. It would position me as reasonable rather than vindictive, while maintaining essential protections for my independent operations. That balanced approach aligns with my priorities, I agreed. I have no desire to damage Maxwell Financial beyond consequences naturally resulting from James's actions. My focus is establishing appropriate terms for moving forward rather than extracting maximum concessions or inflicting unnecessary pain. An admirable perspective that nevertheless maintains appropriate boundaries, Margaret noted with evident approval. Though I should caution that even reasonable positions can trigger emotional responses in contentious divorces. James appears to perceive your independence as personal rejection rather than natural consequence of his actions. That perception may complicate rational settlement despite our best efforts. Which is why your procedural expertise remains essential, I acknowledged. My focus is strategic direction and boundary maintenance. Your experience navigating emotional complexities of high-stakes dissolution provides protection against manipulation I might otherwise miss. Our discussion continued for another hour, developing specific responses to James's settlement proposal with careful attention to both legal precision and strategic positioning. By session's end, we had established clear parameters for acceptable terms while identifying provisions requiring fundamental restructuring rather than mere modification. As I left Margaret's office that afternoon, I felt growing confidence in my position, not just regarding divorce proceedings but broader professional direction. The proving ground of direct confrontation with James and his legal team had confirmed my capability for enforcing boundaries without succumbing to emotional manipulation or vindictive impulses. That confirmation strengthened my conviction about potential independent operations beyond existing corporate structures. My phone chimed with a message from Eleanor Harrison. Considering our conversation yesterday, I've developed an alternative proposal you might find interesting. Available to discuss when convenient. The timing suggested Eleanor had received information about today's settlement meeting, likely through the same informal networks that had informed Philip Maxwell about our previous conversation. Boston's financial ecosystem maintained remarkable information flow despite formal confidentiality boundaries. Rather than responding immediately, I directed my driver toward the Cambridge office space I had quietly leased 3 days earlier. A modest suite in a professional building housing several technology startups and boutique financial firms. The space represented neither commitment to independent operations nor rejection of corporate opportunities, but creation of neutral territory for evaluating options without pressure from existing structures or relationships. The office remained unfurnished except for a single desk, ergonomic chair, and high-performance computer system I had installed yesterday. This minimal configuration provided essential functionality without premature commitment to organizational structure or operational scale. It created space for thought rather than immediate action, something increasingly rare in the accelerating pace of developments following my confrontation with James. Settling at the desk, I opened my laptop and created 3 separate strategic documents. The first outlined potential development of Artemis Capital into independent institutional asset manager, including capital requirements, regulatory considerations, staffing needs, and client acquisition strategies. The second detailed potential, integration with Harrison Global Partners, including synergies, constraints, and governance considerations. The third explored consulting arrangements with Maxwell Financial, including boundary requirements, conflict management, and independence. Protections. Each option received thorough, objective analysis, without emotional weighting toward either vindicating past constraints or avoiding difficult transitions. The exercise wasn't merely academic. It represented applying the investment analysis disciplines I had developed at Artemis toward my own professional future, treating career options as portfolio positions requiring rigorous assessment rather than emotional reaction. 3 hours later, the completed analyses revealed patterns I hadn't fully recognized previously. Each option offered distinct advantages matching different priorities. Harrison provided immediate scale and institutional credibility, but required integration into existing systems that might constrain methodology evolution. Maxwell offered influential relationships and established infrastructure, but entailed navigating complex interpersonal dynamics with James and his allies. Independent development provided maximum methodological freedom, but required building institutional credibility and operational infrastructure from limited foundations. The critical insight emerged not from comparing advantages, but from analyzing constraint patterns across options. Both corporate affiliations imposed structural limitations reflecting their established operational models. Those limitations would inevitably shape investment approaches to match organizational requirements rather than optimal market positioning. Independent development, despite operational challenges, preserved methodological integrity that had generated Artemis's exceptional performance over 8 years. As this clarity emerged, my phone chimed again. A message from Elaine Porter requesting update on settlement discussions and professional considerations. Rather than responding by text, I called directly, eager to share emerging insights with the mentor who had encouraged independent thinking throughout my career. The proving ground has clarified priorities, I explained, after summarizing recent developments. Direct confrontation with James and his legal team confirmed what requires protection versus what can be negotiated. The fundamental value isn't financial capital or existing positions. but methodological approach developed specifically because I operated outside traditional structures and constraints. Precisely what I suspected, Elaine responded, satisfaction evident in her tone. Your investment performance hasn't resulted from applying standard institutional methodologies with slightly better execution. It's emerged from fundamentally different analytical frameworks developed specifically because you operated beyond conventional perspectives, which suggests independent development preserves essential value better than corporate integration, I concluded. Despite operational challenges and credibility requirements associated with building institutional presence without established organizational backing. Those challenges are temporarily daunting, but ultimately conquerable, Elaine observed. Particularly given your capital position and documented performance record, the more interesting question is how exactly you'd structure operations to maintain methodological integrity while developing necessary institutional infrastructure. Her focus on implementation rather than conceptual direction reflected Elaine's pragmatic mentorship style, acknowledging strategic insights while immediately advancing toward practical execution considerations. It was precisely this balanced approach between concept and application that had made her guidance so valuable throughout my career. I've been considering hybrid structures, I shared, developing implementation thinking in real time, establishing core investment operations independently while partnering selectively for specific operational functions where scale efficiencies matter, maintaining methodological independence while leveraging existing infrastructure where appropriate. An intelligent approach requiring careful boundary management, Elaine noted, particularly regarding which functions remain internal versus external. You'll need absolute control over investment methodology and decision processes while potentially outsourcing administrative, compliance, and distribution functions where appropriate. Exactly, I confirmed, the implementation vision crystallizing through our exchange. Core intellectual property and decision frameworks remain proprietary while leveraging partners for functions where established infrastructure offers efficiency without compromising methodological integrity, which might include selective collaboration with Harrison or Maxwell in non-competitive areas, Elaine suggested, extending the concept logically, creating business relationships that serve mutual interests without surrendering independence or creating inappropriate entanglements. The observation opened new strategic possibilities I hadn't fully explored. Rather than viewing corporate opportunities as binary choices, full integration versus complete independence, selective collaboration offered potential hybrid models, preserving essential independence while leveraging established resources where appropriate. That perspective creates interesting possibilities for responding to both Eleanor's and Philip's proposals, I acknowledged. Potential collaborative arrangements structured around specific functions rather than comprehensive integration or consulting. Maintaining your position as independent actor rather than absorbed resource, Elaine agreed, while creating value exchange relationships serving mutual interests without compromising essential boundaries. This reframing transformed my negotiating position regarding both corporate opportunities and divorce settlement. Rather than choosing between competing options or establishing isolation from existing structures, I could develop selective collaborations, serving specific purposes while maintaining fundamental independence. The approach aligned perfectly with investment principles I had applied successfully at Artemis, identifying optimal positioning based on rigorous analysis rather than conventional category assumptions. As our conversation concluded, I felt renewed confidence in my emerging direction. The proving ground of direct confrontation had confirmed not just my ability to maintain boundaries against manipulation, but the fundamental value of perspectives developed outside conventional structures. That confirmation strengthened conviction about establishing independent operations while creating strategic flexibility regarding selective collaborations with existing institutions. Eleanor's message about alternative proposals now appeared, in different context, Potential starting point for selective collaboration rather than comprehensive integration. Philip's consulting offer similarly represented potential focused engagement rather than institutional absorption. Even James's settlement proposal could be reframed around legitimate boundary protection rather than punitive restriction or vindictive exposure. The invisible wife hadn't merely become visible. She had established verifiable value through direct testing against established powers. That testing had confirmed capabilities beyond what either James or Boston's financial establishment had previously recognized. Most importantly, it had clarified what required protection versus what could be negotiated as I established new professional identity beyond constraints of my former marriage. The proving ground had transformed theoretical potential into validated capability, creating foundation for what came next. Not just professional independence, but entirely new ways of engaging with financial systems I had previously navigated from the margins. The outsider's perspective had demonstrated its value through direct application rather than abstract assertion, creating credibility that even the most established powers now recognized and sought to capture. The question was no longer whether that perspective had value, but how best to preserve and expand it while engaging selectively with systems that had previously rendered it invisible. The answers would emerge through continued strategic analysis rather than reactive emotion, applying the same disciplined methodology to my professional future that had generated exceptional returns throughout Artemis's development. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload. From us.